Good afternoon, everyone. My clock here says 2 p.m. Eastern, so we'll go ahead and get started today as some more folks continue to trickle in here. Thank you for attending our January Leadership Webinar, first webinar of the new year. My name is Natalie Abel. I'm a program manager here at iNACOL, and I also help out with the project management for CompetencyWorks. So before we get started today, I have just a few housekeeping items to run through real quickly. In the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a chat box. If you haven't done so already, please introduce yourself. We'd love to know who you are, where you're tuning in from today, and the work you're engaged in around competency education. It's a great way for us to build our networks and learn more about the great work you all are doing. And be sure to ask questions through the chat box as well. We'll save some time at the very end of the webinar for Q&A. So please don't be shy. Today's webinar will be recorded and archived. It will be on both the inacol.org and competencyworks.org websites. So we'll send you all a follow-up email with links to these, so you'll be able to download the slides and access the full recording at any time in the future should you need to refer back. Today's webinar is based on a CompetencyWorks report released a couple months ago, and we'll share that link with you in the chat box here shortly. But know you can also access all CompetencyWorks briefing papers on competencyworks.org. At the top of the website, you can click on Resources and click Briefing Papers, and you'll have access to all the reports, executive summaries, excerpts, and everything that you might need to refer to there. We also encourage you to share what you're learning on social media and Twitter today by using hashtag CompetencyEd and tagging the CompetencyWorks handle, which we can also put in the chat box for you as well. So I don't want to take up too much more time here today, but I am so grateful to have such a tremendous lineup of presenters here with us today. We have Paul Leather from the New Hampshire Department of Education, David Roof from Great Schools Partnership, and Chris Sturgis from CompetencyWorks, who will be sharing their insights on advancing competency education in the New England region. So Chris, turning it over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Natalie. Hello, everybody, and please do introduce yourself. It's so important. So today we're going to cover a lot. So here's just a quick overview. We're going to quickly review the definition of competency education, and we're going to take a minute to reflect about how our understanding is deepening. And then we're going to take a really rapid review of what's going on in each of the New England states. Then David Roof from Great Schools Partnership is going to open our conversation about different types of policy features, and it really can be applied to federal districts and even schools. And so I think you're going to find this conversation really fascinating. Then Paul Leather from New Hampshire is going to share his insights and lessons learned about reciprocal accountability. And this is so important as we all think about ESSA, about a new way of thinking about accountability. And then finally, we're going to just wrap up our conversation about thinking about the future direction. Okay, so let's dive in. How is our understanding of competency education deepening? So for all of you who are brand new to competency education, we're going to just quickly touch on the five-part working definition. This was developed in 2010 with a group of 100 innovators. And in fact, in the paper, Reaching the Tipping Point, we created a small primer about what competency-based education is, and we looked at the traditional system as well. So you can actually find that there. And the other thing I want to say is there are different definitions and different ways of organizing how we talk about competency education. And at Great Schools Partnership, they use proficiency-based learning, but you can find the 10 principles of proficiency-based learning there too to compare and contrast. So let's think about this quickly. Students advance upon demonstrated mastery. This is not just about pace. It is really about how do we make sure that all of our students are successful and actually become proficient. And when we talk about pace, what we're really talking about is an additional instructional time and supports. It's not just about the time, it's about what we do for kids to help them. Explicit and transparent learning objectives empower students and improve instruction. This is the fundamental piece. The transparency changes the entire dynamics of the school systems, and students are able to have much more agency, take much more ownership. And when you have students taking ownership in the classroom, then it's much easier for the teachers to begin to personalize the education and get away from just being in the front of the class answering 1,000 questions. So this is where we spend a lot of time making sure that competency-based schools can do this well. Students receive timely and differentiated support. As I already mentioned, this is absolutely critical to making sure they're actually reaching proficiency. And the other piece of this really is about how do we meet kids where they are. We don't want to go back to tracking because we know that doesn't work, but we also don't want to only deliver grade level curriculum to students who don't have prerequisite skills. So there's got to be a third way, and that's what we're starting to carve out in competency-based education. Aligned assessments are rooted in the cycle of learning. We talk about this as assessments being meaningful for the kids. It means that when we talk about assessments, it's about learning, it's not about accountability. It's about making sure that kids, when they're proficient, when they've already demonstrated proficient, that's when they take a summative assessment. You don't have students taking tests that we already know that they're not proficient for. That's a waste of time. It reinforces students not feeling that they're smart. It's just very counterproductive. And then finally, students develop and apply a broad set of skills and dispositions. And when we think about this, it's really the lifting up of our entire education priorities, that students have higher order skills, that they actually know they've become self-directed learners and they have the habits of work to be able to do that. And that what this means for schools is that the students have the chance to actually transfer their skills or apply them so that they can demonstrate their competency. But it's also about creating more and more learning experiences for students in which they can apply their learning. Now, oops, there we go. We've been talking about these as 3 conditions, but we're actually starting to think that these actually might be more like design principles. But when I visit schools that are becoming competency-based, the ones that seem to be working well have these 3 elements. One, they've really nurtured a growth mindset and very safe, respectful cultures of learning. They have built intrinsic motivation, so their students always are putting their best efforts forward. So it's not just about choice, but there's lots of different ways of developing intrinsic motivation. It's part of the transparency, it's part of the grading system, it's part of inquiry-based learning, and it's about relationships as well. So that's a very important part. And then embedding accountability into school and district operations is about it's how do we create reliability and consistency in our schools. And in that way, we think about calibration and tuning, that teachers really have a shared understanding of what proficiency is, not just in one school, but across schools and across districts. And certainly New Hampshire's PACE effort is absolutely the best example of how to do this statewide. And I just want to add one point here. Going back to the first point around the growth mindset and safe, respectful culture of learning. Increasingly at CompetencyWorks, we're adding language about safety and respect. We noted it a few years ago that safety was raised in more low-income, racially diverse schools and less so in the districts that tend to have white staff and white students. And as we enter this new political era, we believe that this has to be raised consistently and in a more direct way. Students are not going to take risks, and they're not going to do their best work if they're working in environments in which they're afraid or harassed. So this has become all of our responsibilities to ensure that students everywhere, no matter their zip code, creed, color, orientation, or learning challenges, feel safe and respected. So please, as you see opportunities or if you have stories to share, please do so because we want to enhance our work around this. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll take questions in a second. But I want to ask Paul and David, who truly, you guys, these are just some of the most wonderful leaders in our country around competency education. I want to have them have a chance about how they're starting to understand competency education differently over the past couple of years and how their understanding is deepening. So David, would you like to start first? And remember to click the little microphone.
Thanks, Chris. I would make 3 real quick notes, and one of them I just want to recognize, Chris, just the way you talked right now about the third way of students receiving timely and differentiated support, not holding them back or just running them forward, I think is an interesting phrase, and it's an interesting way to kind of frame that work there. And then the other two pieces I would bring up quickly is an ongoing and deeper understanding we are developing around the issue of pace. It seems that most people talk about the need for collaboration and teamwork and students being able to work together. At the same time, we don't want them to be sitting around doing the same thing that they've always done once they've learned something. And so I think we have to think about pace in a different way rather than just, you know, you finish this, you rush on to the next thing. Because when we see that happening, we see kids trying to rush through things with this idea that that actually leads to ownership, and we're not convinced of that, and we're a little concerned that it leads to less than great depth in their learning. So the pace piece is one that I think that we're continuing to think deeply about. And the other one is we talk about assessments, and we're actually trying to think about evidence as opposed to assessments. And that assessments are the strategy that we might employ that would enable kids to develop evidence, but they aren't the only ways that kids could develop evidence. And if we shift our thinking to think more about evidence than assessments, we open up all kinds of different pathways to be able to personalize learning for kids. So those are a couple that I would share, Chris.
Thanks, David. And remember just to undo your little microphone. Okay, Paul, would you like to add your thoughts about competency education?
Yes, thank you, Chris, and it's just great to be on this webinar with both Chris and David, two folks who I highly admire. So here's my big thought, thing that's been kind of growing for me is we feel that we now know that we must deal with systems overall to support big change, not just singular entry points like personalization or competency education assessment or instruction or anywhere, anytime learning. I particularly like this quote that came out in the last week from Andy Calkins from NGLC. Personalized learning is essential but radically insufficient. And he goes on to say it should go without saying that every student's learning pathway should be personalized while still guided by rigorous 21st century expectations. But like the standards movement, personalized learning as a reform strategy is at risk of emerging in practice as a pale or perverted shadow of an idea that was sound in its origins. And doesn't that sound familiar? Young people's experience at public school cannot and should not come to be viewed as an exercise in mastery-based, semi-personalized academic skill development alone. The value of schools in helping children understand, develop capacities for, and successfully navigate being a member of a community is equally as important to them as individuals and for the future of our democracy. So, I think that whole discussion, I think how we think of our schools overall, our role and our students' role in the center of those schools matters so much. And it also goes without saying that we need to address change at multiple levels, classroom, school, district, state, as well as through networks of educators, schools, districts, and the state as a whole. And that way we need to address policy and practice simultaneously, or we will stymie our best educators in ways that may be too cruel to mention. So that's my thought on all of this.
Thanks, Paul. And if anybody knows, Paul Leather thinks systemically probably more than anybody in the country, so I really appreciate that. I want to answer one question. There's a couple of them, but I think it's an important one. Diana asked the issue around how do you guard against competency ed becoming an unmanageable system in which students are all working on different things with no common touchstones to use as a group. And what I want to go back to, Diana, is when we talk about an explicit and transparent set of learning objectives, that is your standards or your competency framework. It's how you organize what kids are supposed to know and be able to do. Students know that, the teachers know that. Now, when you introduce practices related to student ownership and student agency. Kids can take a lot of responsibility. What's key here is that you actually do have some way of doing common assessments. And David talked about students bringing forth evidence of learning, but the assessments, let's not talk about it as a noun, but the process of assessing is being held to a same standard. And because of the transparency, it really allows students to be working in different units or having some voice and choice about how they're learning and how they're demonstrating their learning, but a very common set of assessing that. So I will try to find some resources about that and share as we're going forward. Okay, so now we're going to go to the next section. We're going to quickly talk about how competency-based ed is advancing in each of the New England states. Now, all of this is in the paper, and I'm not going to cover it all, but here is the kind of quick timeline, and you can find this all, again, on CompetencyWorks. But it was really in the 1990s that we started to see the early innovations crop up around competency-based education, and certainly Chugach School District started then and has continued to be competency-based. And then the first decade of 2000, we see Rhode Island and New Hampshire introducing state-level policy. And the Great Schools Partnership and the New England Secondary School Consortium really played a key role here about building agreement to have proficiency-based graduations. So it's interesting to see this. And for those of you from New England, please feel free to add key points that you think happened that we should pay attention. We couldn't get everything on the timeline, but it's really helpful to see everybody's different perspective. So let's just quickly skim through these states. So New Hampshire, we all hear about New Hampshire, have done extraordinary work, and a lot is written. I think one of the things that's most interesting to me is that New Hampshire really led with competency-based credits. They replaced the time-based credit with competency-based credits, and they have done a phenomenal job of building competency ed into the education code and then having a very, very strong theory of change. But what's happened recently is they learned about competency ed, and now there's this growing understanding of personalized learning happening in New Hampshire, and so you see the two pieces kind of coming together in a very exciting way. In Maine, I think one of the lessons we're all learning about there is the proficiency-based diploma. State legislature created a proficiency-based diploma to be supported by a standards-based system, and this is now really starting to come into play. They've staggered the implementation because not every district was ready, but what people are really trying to figure out is what does that mean and what does that look like, and we're going to learn a lot from them. The other thing I think all of us can learn from Maine, and this is so important to remember in all of the states, this is not always a state-driven, top-down process, right? So in Maine, you had these incredibly powerful collaboratives, and I've seen Don Savitsky's been on, has joined us at different points. These collaboratives, such as the Maine Cohort for Customized Learning, really were the districts, the educators who felt that we could do better by kids learning together, and that then built the foundation for it. So for any state wanting to go forward, I really encourage you to learn from Maine around the collaboratives. In Vermont, now Vermont's new in the sense that they kind of passed legislation most recently, but it's not new in the sense is that they have a lot of groundwork, laid the groundwork in the districts and schools, and what they're doing is a personalized system and proficiency-based system. So they're introducing it all together at the state level. So we'll be doing school visits there probably this coming fall to see how they're doing and what their models are looking like. So that's going to be a very exciting time there. In Connecticut, the legislature actually created the Act for Unleashing Innovation in Connecticut Schools. And this was in response to leadership from the school superintendents who really said, wait a minute, we can't get all kids to college and career readiness if we don't personalize the education. And again, if we can't have an equitable system without a competency-based system. So they've introduced these ideas of personalization, and they call it mastery-based learning, by the way, in Connecticut. But what's fascinating to me in Connecticut is that the focus of this act was on high schools or on secondary schools, But what we're seeing is at least 2 districts, and probably more, really developing well-developed K-12 systems. And that's what we want to see actually in Competency Ed. It's all going to work better when it's a K-12 system. In Massachusetts, well, the irony is that we have the early innovators, Diploma Plus and Boston Day and Evening Academy and the Francis Parker Charter Essential Schools really developing Massachusetts, yet Massachusetts really has to date done very little that's related to the advancement of competency education. But once again, the districts are starting to form. They formed a consortium for the Innovative Education Assessment, and what we anticipate seeing is a district-led process of change in Massachusetts. And Rhode Island is a little bit challenging for us because it doesn't fit into any easy story. One of the earliest innovators in terms of statewide policy, introducing a diploma system in 2003. Yet at the same time, there's the legislation there, the education policies talk about individualized plans and multiple opportunities and measures to demonstrate learning and multiple pathways and supports and interventions, all the things you would expect to see in a personalized competency-based system. Yet there's been little or no district-wide transitions to a K-12 system. The high schools do these sets of practices, but it's just now starting to change. And I'm going to be going to visit one district this spring to try to understand a little bit more deeply both how we move from this diploma system to K-12 systems and what's holding it up in Rhode Island. So I'm going to stop there and ask once again Paul and David just for your thoughts, not about necessarily any one of the states, but do you have any observations about New England that you'd want to share with other folks that could help them advance competency education in their regions? And why don't I start with Paul this time?
Sure, Chris. I think what's been, unique about New England is that there have been so many efforts really from the ground up, if you will, individual classrooms, individual schools, districts, and then networks of schools or collaboratives, as you discussed in Maine. But there have been this ground level work going on in each of the states. And because we're such a small community, if you will, there's been a lot of learning across state lines. So we in New Hampshire have learned a lot from some of the work that's going on in Maine, and also some of the early schools in Massachusetts, and even back to the very earliest days in Rhode Island with some of their graduation practices. And I could go around to each of the states and say the same thing. And that's also been highly facilitated by both the Nellie Mae Education Foundation and their ongoing support of the New England Secondary School Consortium and all the work that David and his folks at Great Schools Partnership have been doing. So, we have some great advantages in that we are able to work together and learn from one another over time.
Yeah, you're too kind, Paul. But I would note the collaboration that Paul talks about and the very open willingness of people in the state agencies to share with each other. So it was a conversation that was about learning and growing, much more so than it was a competition about a conversation about competition. And so we've got the state staffs who really engage deeply with each other to try to figure out solutions and learn from each other, and then put those things into place in their own state context. I would add a couple other pieces here real quickly. Really, Paul talked about the importance of the work grew from the ground up, and then there are some policy pieces there. I think it would be fair to note that it's both a policy and a practice piece of work that's happening simultaneously, and that we were fortunate that practice never got too far ahead of policy, and policy never got too far ahead of practice, and so those two pieces supported and moved each other along, so that we didn't have policy that was demanding things that people were trying to worm their way out of, and we didn't have practice where schools and districts get cut off because they were so far ahead of the policy. And then finally, I think we'd be remiss not to note that particularly in New England, we have small districts. And engaging with the community has been a pretty important part here so that the community understands the work that's going on, not only to allow it to happen, but to actively get engaged and support it.
Thanks, David. Okay, so we are going to now move to this to our guest speakers sharing their insights. So we're going to start with David Ruth, who's going to talk about the different types of policy features. David, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. So let me try to go through this relatively quickly for folks. Some of you may have seen this before. So one of the first things to start with around policy is the whole notion of why moving beyond policy permission, because a lot of times educators will simply say, all I want from policy is to leave me alone so I can do what I want to do. But we think it's pretty important to move to get policy that doesn't just allow you to do the work you want to do, but supports you. So it's important to clarify and focus on what matters most, to increase broad-based support from educators and the broader communities, to ensure sustainability of the meaningful work, and so that once it gets into policy, the likelihood that it will continue beyond changes in leadership is higher. It makes equity public, and it brings about change in the schools and in the classrooms. One of the things that we try to focus in on is this notion of high leverage policy. You cannot have policy on everything, or else people would just be chasing that and trying to deal with every small potential circumstance, and that doesn't allow much in terms of growth and leadership in the schools. So we look at getting very targeted with policy and looking at policies that increase academic aspirations for everybody, promote greater equity across students, and importantly, they generate what we call a positive ripple. And so if we can implement this piece here, there will be several other things that will take place as a result of that, beyond just the immediate piece. We worked with our colleagues in the States to develop what we call a high leverage policy framework. You notice that we have these success factors around leverage points, policy features, and implementation contingencies. I'm going to unpack each of those in a second here. That if those are in line, we can get to changing the system, and then we can get to positive student outcomes. A piece that's important to note here about those three success factors is the arrows that go from point to point to point and then back around again. And in most cases, when we're developing policy, we find that you might identify that leverage point and then the features, and when you get to the implementation contingencies, you find you have to change the leverage points. And so it is a circle that goes around there. The biggest thing to note that we're trying to do here is we're trying to change policy from being a political activity, which it always will be to a certain extent, but to lessen the political activity and increase the strategic activity around it. So the leverage points, those are the pieces of the policy that the objectives that you're really trying to get at. The issue you're trying to focus in on. Where are you trying to look at? Is it leadership? Is it in classroom practice? Is it in funding? The specific things that you're trying to get at, and we would encourage people to try to get as specific on that as possible. What is the target area you're trying to get at? When you look at the policy features, it's the intentional predetermined features of a policy, and this is important. It's both written and unwritten. So those pieces that, while it might not actually be in the language, you know are going to happen as a result of this being in place. Going deeper here, it's that mixture between pressure and support. We believe strongly that you must have both pressure and support. In many cases, the failure of policy is because we put too much emphasis either on pressure or too much on support. So we put pressure and we mandate things and we see people rebel, or we just put support out there and we hope that things will happen and people actually don't ever get off the dime. It's a bit of both, and one of the tricky pieces is figuring out how much of each. It's the breadth and specificity of the leverage point. It's the coherence with the existing policies, and a piece I'm going to dig into in this next slide is the idea of a goal strategy continuum. So if you look at this piece here, looking at this graph, on the left, think high and low. I don't have numbers. If you want to put 100 and 0, 10 million and 0, it's just more and less, the key things to think about there. And on the bottom, you have this notion of a prescriptive strategy on one end and a goal-oriented strategy on the other end. Simplistically, to give you an example of that, a prescriptive strategy, policy around a prescriptive strategy would say, here is an advisory program, you must use this program, here's the notebook you're going to use on it, it's going to tell you where you have to be on day 1, day 2, day 3, you have to follow this to the letter of the law specifically. Whereas on the other end, it would be something that was more along the lines of saying, we want all kids to be known well, and each school has to come up with a way to do that. So you can see that both of them are about relationships between kids and adults, but they're very different in the prescription that's there. When you do that, there are a couple things that happen. If you take a look at your monitoring requirements, you will have very high monitoring requirements with a prescriptive strategy. You're asking people to be on a specific page at a specific time, in that example I just shared. If you want to make sure that's happening, it takes a lot to monitor that. If it's goal-oriented, you don't have to monitor as much because people are devising their own strategies. It's the same way, educator ownership and local control. If it's very prescriptive, there's very little ownership of that. I'm just doing what you tell me to do. Whereas if I have to design what I'm going to do, it's very high. And then finally, the current school and district capacity to implement a prescriptive strategy, I just have to follow the rules. To implement a goal-oriented strategy, I have to figure out what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do that. So let's look for a minute here how this plays out. Okay. So if you do something that's much more on the goal-oriented end, and you see the dotted line that goes up here, and you look at where that intersects with the district capacity, you must have pretty high capacity in order to be able to implement that, because you're asking people to think of something, create something, fit it to their context, make it happen. And so in order to do that, your knowledge base has got to be pretty high. If, as you see on the left-hand side, that arrow coming in from the left shows that your capacity is low, then you've actually asked people to do something that they're not capable of doing. And so you have a knowledge and skill gap that's in there. Now the good news on this case, you can actually overcome this problem by providing professional development. All this tells you here is you've got to give people the capacity to be able to do what they want to do. And so you've got a professional development, learning, planning, all of that. The other good news to look at that is the money you may have had to spend either at a district or a state level on monitoring requirements, you can actually now spend that on professional development because your monitoring requirements are low. But let's look at a different example. Let's say you make your prescriptive strategy, at your policy at the very end of the prescriptive strategy end, okay? And now you look and say, okay, the good news here is the capacity that teachers will have to have in order to implement this is significantly less. The problem is if their capacity is significantly higher, now you're going to have aggravation and anger, which leads to poor implementation. Because in this case, teachers can think of things that are better to do in their context, and you're not allowing them to do that. This issue here is very, very difficult in our experience to overcome because you can't take away capacity from people. You can only add knowledge base to do that work. Looking at implementation contingencies, these are the contextual factors and foreseeable contingencies that may arise. So this is looking at stuff that if you know that you're asking people to do something and the financial resources aren't high enough there for them to be able to do that, the likelihood of failure is very high. And so this is one of those pieces where you have to take a look and say, if we go forward with this, we've determined what our leverage point is, we've looked at our policy features, we've determined the right amount of pressure and support, we've determined where it is on the prescriptive strategy to a goal-oriented strategy continuum, but now we figure out that we actually don't have the resources to provide the professional development, or we don't have the resources to give teachers the time to create these pieces. And so while what you may have designed generically is valuable, the likelihood of success is very, very limited. And so you'd have to go back up to your leverage point, rethink that, go to your policy features, rethink that, and move that work forward. Pulling this all together, here's a quick example around graduation requirements. The leverage point for the graduation requirements is a required senior exit exhibition of some sort. It's a state mandate that you have to do that. They haven't put out exactly what it looks like, and they put in capacity building to do that. And then there's the engagement of district and school leadership in the creation of their exhibition models to be able to do that. That leads to a redesigned curriculum because, again, if you are, here's the ripple effect piece. If students are all going to have to go through an exhibition of some sort, then you've got to rethink what it means for them to be in high school. You need to rethink what it means for them to be in middle school. You need to rethink what it means for them to be in elementary school because they're all working towards that end. So not only do you get that experience for kids, you actually impact the curriculum all the way through to that point, even to the point of adding things like potentially an initial strategy on that in the 10th grade, or something moving from middle school to high school. You influence all those pieces to change that. And then hopefully that would lead to an increase in learning 21st century skills, college readiness, etc. Very quickly, let me run through this. I'm not going to actually go through all these, but show you these. These things are the district and school policy checklists that when you're looking to implement proficiency, competency, or mastery, we have seen all schools work with all these different areas, from the obvious ones, the graduation requirements, to the not so obvious ones of transcripts, to the grading and reporting system, to promotion retention, academic interventions, portfolios, attendance, a big thing on attendance. If we're more about learning than we are about time, how does that impact the attendance? So there's a bunch of pieces that you can see here on this. And just as an FYI, the letters there fall in line with the National School Board Association's nomenclature there. So I think that is all of my piece. I'll stop there, Chris, and turn back to you.
Thanks, David. So I have to say, every time I hear David talk about this, I learn more and more, and I was thinking more about this kind of ripple effect, because that's exactly what happens with the competency-based schools. You don't put everything in place. You move one thing and then the other. I think that it's important around these policy features is to think about this just as much for states to districts as districts to schools, and even within schools about how to most engage educators. I didn't see any specific questions. So what I'm going to do is we're going to now move to reciprocal accountability. So once you've started to do a goal-oriented strategy, the question is, how do you manage that within a state or within a district? And Paul's going to share his insights about that. Paul?
Thank you, Chris. I think what I'm going to share in many ways is an example of some of what David was talking about kind of theoretically, and so maybe folks can pick out how that is the case. In New Hampshire, we think that it's important to have a theory of change in action at the systems level in order to get where you want to go. And so this idea of reciprocal accountability as a way to connect both policy and practice has been actually really central to our work in New Hampshire. For PACE, which was the Performance Assessment of Competency Education in New Hampshire, which is really our most fully realized example of a system of competency education across our state. This means local educators and leaders are involved in designing and implementing the assessment and accountability systems and receive intense technical policy and practical support and guidance from the State Department of Education. PACE attempts to foster organizational learning and change by appealing to the intrinsic motivation of adults to improve their work rather than relying on a top-down accountability system and compliance strategies. It was just such a discussion held within the confines of the state's Accountability Task Force in 2014 where the idea for PACE was actually born. The group was made up of superintendents, curriculum supervisors, teachers, association chapter directors, and others, as well as State Department folks, and weighed in on the idea of moving to a new kind of accountability system more in keeping with competency education. A superintendent at that time, Chris Rath of the Concord, New Hampshire district, said no in uncertain terms. Well, you know, we can't take on something this innovative without you providing us some space to innovate. With a Common Core, smarter balanced assessments, and other efforts all being implemented just in this year, our educators are overburdened as it is. After some discussion by the entire group, the group agreed to the idea of advancing a pilot to include volunteering districts, where smarter balance would be implemented in grade spans, elementary, middle, and high school, and a bank of complex performance tasks would be developed and offered in intervening years. In this way, the idea of space to innovate was actually injected into our New Hampshire's accountability system, and the decision was made by this group of educators, including folks in the field, technical experts, and then the department staff. This is an example of how folks at various levels can work together, even around issues as intense as accountability, and hold themselves accountable to the larger system. When New Hampshire thought about building out our system, we wanted to stay true to our core, our values, and in terms of student learning. We wanted to make sure that deep, rich tasks for students were at the center of the work, and that content, educator capacity, and student engagement was in the service of deeper learning. We also wanted to hold to our long-time commitment to a competency-based system where the larger system supports educators engaged in local innovation as the driver, and that the overall system needs to be integrated and coherent in order to fully engage all stakeholders in moving forward. Our systems approach in PACE is different in a way in how we scale competency-based education, in that it includes an accountability system that is not statewide, but involves those districts that have demonstrated readiness for the pilot through full engagement with competency education. They've undergone training in constructing and scoring complex performance assessments, have implemented competency education across their schools and districts, and have dedicated leadership and community support in the effort. Last year, in the second year of our U.S. Department of Education approved pilot, 7 districts and 1 charter school participated. This year there are 8 districts and 2 charter schools, and it would be larger except it was limited by the U.S. Department of Education in terms of the pilot. And as you can see on the right side of this slide, we have a number of additional districts lining up, preparing and demonstrating the readiness, and more being added on a weekly basis. We believe to truly innovate in public education, you need to have a starting place where schools and districts can demonstrate their capacity to do the work with supports and guardrails evident to all in order to join. This is the same kind of deliberate scaling approach that you see in ESSA in Section 1204, Innovative Assessment and Accountability Demonstration Authority, that's going to be opening up, hopefully, if the new administration lets it happen. Here is essentially our multi-tiered system of support for educators, schools, and districts. Tier 1 are implementing districts that are fully competency-based and involved in professional development and calibration and scoring practices for districts implementing a full accountability system as we speak. Tier 2 are districts that are preparing for implementation with professional development and performance assessment and implementation. These districts may possibly be implementing in the following year. And then Tier 3 are those that are just developing competency education, and they are getting support in competency development, instructional practice, assessment, and grading. These are for districts that need to build their system. They have a high interest, but they really are just looking at doing this for the first time. We have a number of state partners Center for Assessment, the New Hampshire Learning Initiative, I'm going to talk about in a second, as well as Reaching Higher New Hampshire, our advocacy arm, as well as institutional supports at the State Board Governor's Office and the New Hampshire Legislature, and then national partners like foundations, the Center for Collaborative Education and the Center for Innovation in Education in Stanford. To do all of this work, we realized we needed a support entity constructed closer to the ground, led by New Hampshire educators, dedicated and to recognizing how their skill can really advance the work over time. The New Hampshire Learning Initiative is a nonprofit we've constructed to create grassroots support for our tiered system. Jonathan Vanderels is focused on 4 main projects that are core to our scaling effort, reaching across all 3 tiers: work-study practices, a New Hampshire term for the developmental frameworks for skills and dispositions put out by the Center for Innovation in Education at the University of Kentucky, as well as supporting our PACE work with contracted leaders like Ellen Hume Howard of Sanborn, as well as 2 different cohorts of implementation school teacher leaders, one for content and another for task development, and the other for a change in terms of competency education. Lastly, I'd like to just share with you an example of one of these network projects funded through the Assessment for Learning project from the Center for Innovation in Education. It's available across all of our 3 tiers. It's called No Grades, or NG2, and it's focused on personalization through creating multi-age learning environments based on the Wisconsin personalized learning model. And we built this and connected it to work that Allie Brown at 2 Revolutions and NGLC, Andy Calkins and his folks. And we're finding that multi-age learning provides a rich opportunity for interpersonal and individual learning by bringing children of different ages and ability levels together. And children work as individuals, pairs, triads, small groups, large groups, or whole class. And these short-term groupings are based on interests, needs, learning style, problem solving, skill instruction, and reinforcement. And so we see that children move from easier to more difficult material and from simple to more complex strategies at their own pace. And they're viewed as individuals, and expectations are adjusted for each child to promote social, emotional, physical, aesthetic, and cognitive development. Students are required to produce ideas, integrate knowledge, and complete tasks that have real-world applications. You will note in this project and in many of the others that all of the levels of our work we attempt to maintain a coherence of policy and practice, research and attention to educator and student need that is necessary to making a reciprocal accountability system work. I think I'm going to stop here, Chris, with that picture of our work and see if there are any questions.
Great, thanks, Paul. Well, we have one question, which is actually just a clarification, but if, well, I'm going to ask you, there's 2 questions. I'm going to ask them both to you. One is, could you just explain what a multi-age group is and why it's important? And then also, how is progress communicated without grades? So people are really engaged around this personalized inclusive education pathways. So could you speak a little bit, or if Allie's on the here, maybe she can help in the chat room too.
Right, and I would invite Allie to jump in if she'd like, but we have different schools applying different multi-age groups. So we focus primarily at elementary, the elementary level from K to 6. But recently our planning group decided that this really just needs to be a full K-12 system, and so we're looking at how we can expand it in that regard. And but I think initially we're looking at adding grades to one another. So K1, K1-2, K1-2-3, 2-3, 2-3-4, like that. And as folks build that out, then they create more openness and freedom. We're just in the first couple years of this project, so this is work that we want to do right, and have folks build it at their level. And so we have a number of schools that are going about this in their way, but they're receiving lots of technical support as they go forward. In terms of progress communicated without grades, there are in fact some grades that are ultimately summative down the road, but I think this gets back to this issue that David was talking about, that what we're looking for actually is more student evidence of their learning within their various models of learning, following their trajectory of learning over time. And so those evidences all add up in a portfolio model, and then will in fact be run up into a summative model. Part of our PACE work is in fact how do we collect the body of student evidence over time and determine their proficiency to make sure that students aren't falling behind. That we want to make sure we have an equitable system that addresses the needs of all kids. So we're still figuring that out, but that's a big part of the design. I note that there's also a question about students with disabilities, and really that's what I was just talking about, that we want to build, whether a student is in an IEP or not, that the learning trajectory is based on supports that are appropriate for that individual student, and that the IEP is built into the learning curriculum and design in the classroom as they go forward. This takes tremendous work on the part of educators and teams of educators so that they can support both individual needs as well as the group as a whole of students. I think we may be through all the questions.
Thanks, Paul. That was really helpful. David, we didn't talk about talking about this issue, but I know that you'll have some thoughts. I'd like to just continue a little bit more on special education because it's an important issue and we haven't really talked or written about it enough in our field. And David, do you have any thoughts of, it can be from the policy perspective or from districts implementation about special education and what people should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think the key thing to think about with special education comes down to the number and specificity of your standards, whatever you want to call them, graduation standards or performance indicators or competencies, whatever you are using, whatever the learning is that kids have to demonstrate in order to move on. You have to be careful about how many of those you have and the specificity of those, and realizing that if we have hundreds and thousands of those, kids won't be able to demonstrate all of those. And if we hold kids accountable to every single one of those, we're going to run ourselves into a problem that just becomes exacerbated anytime we have special education students. And so we want to get clear about the performance expectations as we would identify those through scoring criteria. We want to provide the supports that enable all kids, whether they're special education or not, to be able to demonstrate those pieces of learning. But I think we've got to set up the system that enables kids to be successful, as opposed to a system that is so overbuilt that that many students struggle, let alone students who are in special education.
Thanks.
Chris, if I could also add to that question. So I think the trick here, particularly in a competency-based environment where we are looking for it to be student-centered and personalized, so we need to know that a student is advancing in a way that they're going to reach, the outcome that we're looking for. So we remain interested that a student is at the appropriate level, right? Their development is appropriate. At the same time, we know that students will develop it in their zone of proximal development, right? That you've got to be offering them standards and the learning that's tied to those standards in a way that is meaningful to them. So I think what we're finding is more and more of our educators are trying to balance those two expectations. This is where these students at this at this point of their development, they should be here, but how do I support each and every one of those students going forward so that they are truly deeply engaged in their learning? And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the practice deepen over time.
Thanks, Paul. Okay, so we're going to move into our final little piece here, and it's going to be just 1 second, which is just talking about what do we think is going to happen. So when I was doing this research, these were some of the questions that were kind of popping up for me, like what's really going to happen here? And we have no answers, of course, and I just want to turn it over to Paul and David to just have their one thought. It might be advice, it might be a question, it might be something you're excited about, but what's the future direction for advancing competency education in New England? And how about Paul?
Yeah, I think that staying as close to the work of student learning as possible and creating structures and systems that will support that work, that really gets to this idea that we're supporting high expectations for all students, that educator capacity is as high as it can possibly be to support this work. That it's not easy, and also that students are engaged in deep project-based learning and authentic tasks that are highly meaningful and excite them and engage them in learning. I think the more we focus on that, and the less we focus on the policy side, which is constantly churning. We have the issues of the Trump administration, we have change at the state level, we have change in superintendents, we have changes in principals. All of those things keep churning. So I think the learning that we have had, I think in New Hampshire, I think in Maine, all of our states in New England, has been as long as we stay close to that work and keep that front and center for us, then we will continue to make progress. If we get distracted by the politics, if we get distracted by the folks on high who might want to change the signals, then I think it's going to hold us back, because we're deep into some real rich work now, and we should not let go.
Oh my gosh, you've totally inspired me. I'm going to write about that, Paul. Thank you. David, what would your thoughts be about the future direction in competency ed in New England?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of Paul's words. I think he is right on target. My biggest fear, I'm not sure if it's capturing your questions here, Chris, is that we settle for competency being an organizational design issue rather than an instructional issue. And so we look at it as if we have seen historic examples in the past where there was a big push to go to smaller schools with the idea that that would lead to better instructional practice, but we just went to smaller schools and we never changed instruction. And so I live in fear that that's the piece where we're going to end up failing. I think the strategy around that is we really have to trust educators. And I think a lot of what we've done historically has been a strategy to try to work around teachers in the classroom. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. That we need to trust educators, and to trust them we need to build capacity. Perhaps the Achilles heel of a lot of this work is around assessment literacy. Everybody can tell time, and so when we base our system on time, we know they've been there long enough, we send kids down the road. If the system is based on kids actually demonstrating their learning, and if we want to move beyond it being an assessment-based system to an evidence-based system, we have to build the capacity of educators to be able to make high-quality, consistent judgments that we trust on the learning of students. And so I would urge people, to think about the policy, deal with that, put it in place that can actually enable educators to innovate, but consistently build capacity of educators being the key element that will lead to success.
Great, David, thank you so much. You guys, I'm going to loop back to you because I want to write about this. This is really helpful. So I'm going to thank you both for your time You've just been wonderful. All of you here in the chat room, thank you so much. It was a great conversation in there, too. I just want to let everybody know it's on CompetencyWorks right now. We're going to have a national summit on K-12 competency-based education in June. We're having 100 innovators once again come together. But now, because we have thousands upon thousands of people doing competency education, anybody who has 1 year of experience in competency-based ed, we'd like to invite you to join one of the technical advisory groups on equity, quality, policy, and meeting kids where they are. And you can find more about that at competencyworks.org. So Paul, David, thank you. Looking forward to all the next wonderful things you do for our country. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.